Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, there has been a lot of talk, and in fact, one of the major issues that we as a nation are going to have to deal with, and certainly the presidential candidates will be talking about during the next 4 months, is the fact that we have a $16 trillion national debt and we have a $1 trillion deficit. And I think all Americans understand that this is a very important issue, and it's something that we as a nation are going to have to grapple with. And how we deal with that, how we deal with the deficit and the national debt, is certainly one of the most important issues and interesting issues that we're going to have to address. What I find interesting, Madam President, is that when we talk about the deficit and the national debt, there seems to be among some of my colleagues a collective amnesia. It is just as if this debt and deficit popped up yesterday and we have no understanding of how we got to where we are today. So I would like to take a moment to remind some of my friends that back in January of 2001, not so many years ago, when President Bill Clinton left office, this country was not running a deficit. It was running, in fact, a very significant surplus of some $236 billion. That is a very significant surplus. As a matter of fact, Madam President, in 2001, the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, projected that we would have federal budget surpluses totaling $5.6 trillion from 2002 through 2011. In other words, Clinton left office a very significant surplus, and the projection was that that surplus was going to go up and up and up. What happened? Well, that is a question we need a little bit of time to discuss, because I find it interesting that there is no context for deficit reduction. So let me suggest to you, Madam President, in fact, that some of the people who come down to this floor, who talk loudest about the deficit and the national debt, are precisely those same people who caused the national debt, $16 trillion, and the deficit over $8 trillion. Now, how do we get to where we are today from the time when Clinton left office, where we had a significant surplus? Well, number one, many of our deficit hawks who today are coming down the floor telling us about all the programs we have to cut for the middle class, for working families, for our children, for the elderly, they are real deficit hawks. My goodness, when it came to the war in Iraq, a war which many of us voted against, didn't make a whole lot of sense to us, but we also noted that our deficit hawk friends went to war for, I believe, the first time in the history of America, for getting to pay for that war. So I think some of us might hold a little bit in doubt some of the comments of our friends about their real sincerity and their concern about deficit reduction when they went to a war in Iraq, which will end up, after we take care of the last veteran wounded in that war 80 years from now or whatever, probably at some $3 trillion. Well, if you spend $3 trillion going to war and you forget to pay for it, and you come to the floor and you tell us how concerned you are about the deficit and the national debt, some of us are saying, well, maybe that ain't the case. Where were your concerns about the deficit when you went to war, when you had a deficit hawk president named George W. Bush? So that is one of the major reasons we're running $1 trillion deficit right now. Second reason is, you don't have to be a PhD in economics to understand it, that if in the middle of a war you decide to give huge tax breaks, including $1 trillion over a 10-year period, to the top 2%, to billionaires and millionaires. So $1 trillion is not coming in to the federal government. That adds to the deficit. So I asked my good friends, my Republican friends, where was your concern about the deficit and the national debt when you gave $1 trillion in tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires? Third point I would make. We are in the middle right now of a horrendous recession. Unemployment sky high, underemployment sky high. People have lost their homes, their life savings. People are hurting. This recession was caused by the efforts that I must confess, not just a Republican effort, a Democratic effort, bipartisan desire to deregulate Wall Street, because people believe that if you deregulate Wall Street and you allow insurance companies to merge with commercial banks, to merge with investor banks, and you do away with Glass-Steagall, my goodness, those folks on Wall Street, honest people of great integrity, will just create wealth for all of Americans. That's what Alan Greenspan, Robert Rubin, and all these guys were telling us. I myself, who was a member of the Financial Services Committee of the House, never believed that for one moment. Never made an iota of sense to me. But anyhow, these guys fought for deregulation. We had deregulation, and as a result of the greed, recklessness, and illegal behavior on Wall Street, we were plunged into the terrible recession we're in right now. And one of the points that is very rarely made on the floor is that today, at 15.4% as a percentage of GDP, that revenue at 15.2% as a percentage of GDP is the lowest in more than 60 years. So it is easy for people to come to the floor here and say, we got to cut. But they forget to tell us is that as a result of this Wall Street-caused recession, at 15.2%, revenue is the lowest as a percentage of GDP in more than 60 years. That is an issue that we have to deal with. But you know what? You don't increase your revenue when you give more tax breaks to billionaires. You don't increase your revenue when you say that at a time when we have tripled military spending since 1997, maybe we need even more for the military. That's not a way to reduce the deficit. Now, what do my Republican friends and some Democrats say? Well, they come to the floor and they have suddenly, after going to war without paying for it, after giving huge tax breaks to the rich, after deregulating Wall Street, they suddenly have realized that we have a deficit problem. And they're very concerned about this deficit problem. And they come to the floor and they say, oh, the only way that we can go forward is to cut Social Security. Oh, but Social Security is funded independently. Hasn't added one nickel to the deficit. But we're going to cut Social Security anyhow. We're going to cut Medicare. We're going to cut Medicaid. We're going to cut Pell Grants. We're going to cut education. We're going to cut environmental protection. That's deficit reduction. Are we going to ask millionaires and billionaires who are doing phenomenally well, whose effective tax rate is the lowest in decades, to pay one nickel more in taxes? No. Nope, we can't do that. We can't do that, but we can cut Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education, and every program that the children of this country, the seniors of this country, the working families of this country depend upon. Now, to add insult to injury in terms of this movement supported by the big money interests who have so much influence over what goes on here in Congress, to add insult to injury, it is important to look at the playing field of the American economy today to understand what's going on. Are the people on top really hurting and suffering? Are large corporations today really struggling under onerous corporate taxes? The answer is obviously not. Madam President, we don't talk